Captain Adrian Cross floated in the vast emptiness of space, staring at the small, flickering screen of his ship's control panel. His vessel, the Horizon, was a sleek, solitary explorer, built for deep space missions. For days, the quiet had been overwhelming. There were no signals, no disturbances, just silence. A routine mission, he thought. Another trip to the outer edges of the galaxy and back. But as he sipped his coffee, a strange noise cut through the stillness. A sudden beep from the communications console. Cross looked up, surprised. The sound was irregular, unfamiliar. His eyes narrowed as he tapped a few keys. A garbled, distorted message filled the screen. It was a distress signal, but the language was nothing he'd ever heard before. The transmission was weak, fragmented, almost as if it had been sent through a broken network. "Is this a prank?" Cross muttered to himself, staring at the scrambled words. No, it was too genuine. The tone in the voice on the other end carried urgency. Whoever sent this message needed help, and badly. He sat forward in his chair. For a moment, he debated whether to ignore the signal and continue with his mission. After all, he was alone on a deep space exploration trip. It wasn't his job to go chasing down random distress calls. But Cross had always been the curious type. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening out there, and he was the only one who could answer it. "All right, let's see what we have here," he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. The ship's system began to lock onto the source of the signal, and the coordinates appeared on the display. Cross hesitated for a moment before entering the coordinates into the navigation system. His heart raced slightly. What could he expect to find out there? A malfunctioning ship. A lost crew. He set the course and engaged the thrusters. As the ship hummed to life, Cross leaned back in his seat, letting his mind wander. He thought about the risks. Was it worth it? But in the end, he knew the answer. If there was even the slightest chance someone was in danger, he couldn't just leave them out there. It wasn't in his nature. Hours later, the stars around him began to shift. The ship neared the source of the signal, a small, uncharted corner of space. He could see it now. An alien vessel, a massive structure, dark and drifting in the silence of the cosmos. The ship was in disrepair, barely clinging to life as it floated like a ghost in space. Cross's fingers hovered over the controls, and a sense of foreboding settled over him. The distress signal had stopped, and the only sound now was the steady hum of the Horizon's engines. The alien ship loomed before him, its surface pocked with damage. Cross could see no signs of movement, no lights blinking. The sight made his heart beat faster. Who could have survived in a place like that? And why was it abandoned? Time to find out, Cross said to himself, determined. With a deep breath, he guided the Horizon toward the ship, ready for whatever lay ahead. Captain Adrian Cross carefully guided his ship, the Horizon, closer to the alien vessel. His hands gripped the controls tightly as his eyes studied the strange ship that loomed ahead. It was enormous, far larger than anything he had ever seen. The ship's surface was dark, covered in dents and scorch marks. It looked ancient, battered, and broken. Drifting silently in the vast emptiness of space, Cross's ship made a slow, calculated approach. His thoughts raced. What kind of ship was this? Who were the beings on board? And why had they sent that distress signal? He activated the ship's docking system, making sure that the Horizon was securely attached to the alien vessel. The lock clicked, and Cross felt a slight shudder in the hull. He was now connected to a ship that had been adrift in space for who knows how long. He tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine, knowing that he couldn't turn back now. "All right, here we go," he muttered to himself, grabbing his helmet and suit. His boots clanked against the floor as he walked toward the airlock. He paused for a moment, checking the ship's systems again. Everything seemed fine, but the unknown always held a sense of danger. The airlock door slid open with a hiss, and Cross stepped into the alien ship. His helmet's flashlight illuminated the eerie darkness ahead. The interior was unlike anything he had imagined. The walls were lined with strange symbols and alien technology that pulsed dimly in the low light. The air was thick and musty, a faint metallic smell hanging in the atmosphere. He heard no movement, no voices, nothing. The silence was deafening, making him feel isolated in the vast emptiness. Cross stepped forward cautiously, his boots echoing in the hollow ship. The floor beneath him was uneven, and the ship creaked and groaned as if it were on the verge of collapsing. As he moved deeper into the vessel, he finally spotted something. Shadows shifting in the dim light. Cross froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Were there survivors? Could they be hiding from him, waiting for him to make a mistake? "Hello," Cross called out, his voice breaking the silence, his word tongue in the air, unanswered. The tension grew as he continued forward, his mind racing with questions. Then he saw them. A group of alien beings huddled in the far corner of the room. Their forms were strange, tall, slender, and almost translucent, with large, dark eyes. They didn't seem hostile, but their expressions were fearful. They glanced up at Cross, their eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and confusion. They had been waiting for someone, but Cross wasn't sure they were expecting a human. One of them, a tall figure with silver-blue skin, stepped forward slowly. Its movements were cautious, but there was a sense of recognition in its eyes. The alien seemed to be trying to communicate, but Cross could hear no words. Instead, a series of clicks and hums filled the air. The sound was unlike any language Cross had ever heard. Cross took a deep breath. "I'm here to help," he said, trying to sound calm and reassuring. The alien stared at him, still silent. Cross could only guess what they were thinking. Had they even seen a human before? Could they understand him? He wasn't sure, but he didn't have time to waste. He stepped closer, extending his hand as a gesture of peace. The alien with silver-blue skin hesitated, then slowly reached out. The moment their hands touched, Cross felt a strange warmth, a sense of connection that he couldn't explain. The alien's eyes softened, and Cross realized that, despite the language barrier, they both understood one thing: survival. The alien gave a slight nod, then gestured toward the back of the ship. It seemed to be asking Cross to follow. Cross followed, his mind racing with questions. What had happened to this ship? How long had they been stranded? And most importantly, could he fix their problems before it was too late? Captain Cross followed the alien crew through the dark corridors of their ship, his boots clicking against the uneven floor. The aliens moved ahead with silent grace, their long, slender bodies gliding through the ship with an ease that Cross found both fascinating and unnerving. He tried to keep his steps steady, watching them closely. There were no signs of hostility, but the air was thick with tension. The group led Cross into what appeared to be the ship's control room. The room was large, with panels covered in strange symbols and glowing lights. The consoles looked advanced, far beyond anything Cross had seen, but many of them were damaged, flickering in and out. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the hum of failing systems filled the air. Cross glanced around, noting the technology. Some of it looked familiar, while other pieces were completely foreign. He could tell that the ship had once been a marvel of engineering. Now, it seemed like a dying thing, clinging to life in the cold emptiness of space. As the aliens gathered around a central panel, Cross tried to make sense of the situation. He could see their worry, their uncertainty. Their faces, though different from human features, were filled with the same emotions Cross had seen in others before: fear, frustration, desperation. The alien with silver-blue skin, who had led him here, turned to face him. Its large black eyes studied him intently, and for a moment, Cross thought it might speak. But instead, it raised its hand, pointing toward the broken console. The gesture was clear enough. The alien was showing him the problem. Cross moved closer to the panel, squinting at the damage. The console was a mess of wires and sparks, with parts clearly burnt out. It would be impossible for any of the aliens to fix this. From the looks of it, they had tried and failed. Cross's mind raced as he examined the damage. He had only a basic understanding of alien technology, but he was a skilled engineer. He had spent years working on Earth's spacecraft, and he knew how to think creatively when it came to repairs. This wouldn't be easy, but it wasn't impossible either. "Okay," Cross muttered to himself, stepping back and taking a deep breath. "Let's see what we can do." The silver-blue alien watched him carefully, then turned to the rest of the crew. They all seemed to understand what was happening, though they still remained silent, unsure of how to communicate. Cross started by opening a nearby panel to inspect the wiring. It was unlike anything he had worked with before, but he quickly identified some common components. He needed to stabilize the power grid and reroute some of the energy. The problem was complex, but it was possible with the right approach. The aliens watched him work, their eyes following his every move. Cross could feel their gaze, the weight of their hope pressing down on him. They were counting on him. He couldn't afford to fail. Hours passed as Cross carefully rewired the damaged systems. He had to improvise, using tools and materials from the ship's storage. But slowly, the lights brightened, and the hum of the ship grew steadier. The systems were coming back online. One of the aliens stepped forward, its green skin shimmering under the light. It made a low sound, almost like a purr. Cross paused, looking up at the creature. It was a strange sound, but somehow comforting. "Thank you," Cross said quietly, though he wasn't sure if the alien understood his words. The alien's black eyes softened, and it gave a small nod, the first real sign of gratitude Cross had seen from them. It seemed that despite the language barrier, they had understood him. They had hope again. Cross stood up, wiping his hands on his suit. There was still much to do, but this was a good start. As the crew began to inspect the ship's systems, Cross felt a sense of pride. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time since he arrived, he saw something more than fear in their eyes. He saw trust. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Cross knew that there was still a long way to go before the ship would be fully functional again. But with the crew's trust and his skills, he felt confident that they could make it. They weren't alone anymore. As Captain Cross worked alongside the alien crew to get their ship functioning again, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. The damage to the ship was worse than he had initially realized, and with every step he took, it became clearer just how much the crew had been struggling. The silence that filled the ship was heavy, like a weight pressing down on everyone. The aliens had no way of fixing things on their own, and Cross was their last hope. He wiped the sweat from his brow as he continued to work on the wiring, his hands moving swiftly and precisely. The ship's strange technology was challenging, but he was making progress. He could feel the crew's eyes on him as they watched from the shadows. They had stopped trying to speak, leaving Cross to work in quiet solitude. The only sound was the soft hum of the ship's flickering systems and the occasional beep from a console he was fixing. After several hours of working on the ship's power grid and rerouting the energy flow, Cross decided it was time to get a better understanding of what had happened. He needed more information if he was going to fix the bigger problems. He turned to the silver-blue alien who had first led him to the control room. "Can you show me what happened to the engine?" Cross asked, his voice calm but firm. The alien looked at him for a long moment, as if considering whether to answer. Then, with a soft nod, it turned and gestured for Cross to follow. Cross followed the alien through the winding corridors of the ship, each step echoing in the quiet space. As they passed through rooms filled with alien technology, Cross couldn't help but be amazed by the sophistication of their design. The ship was unlike anything he had ever seen before, but despite its beauty, it was clear that the ship had seen better days. They reached the engine room, and Cross was immediately struck by the sight before him. The engine was massive, a complex tangle of wires, pipes, and strange glowing components, but it was clearly malfunctioning. Parts of the engine had burned out, and large sections of it were completely offline. The lights flickered above, and the faint smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Cross stepped closer to examine the damage. The main power core had been fried, and several key components had shorted out. The damage was extensive, and he knew it would take more than a few hours to fix. It wasn't just a technical problem, it was a survival issue. Without a working engine, the ship couldn't move, and the crew had no way of getting back to their home planet. Turning to the silver-blue alien, Cross asked, "How long have you been stranded here?" The alien hesitated for a moment before responding with a series of clicks and hums. Cross couldn't understand the language, but he could tell by the tone that the answer wasn't good. The crew had been stranded for a long time. Weeks, maybe months. It was clear they had run out of food and water. Their energy reserves were low, and the hope in their eyes had begun to fade. They had tried everything to fix the ship, but their technology wasn't enough. Cross nodded, his mind racing. He had to act quickly. The crew didn't have much time left. He couldn't waste any more moments. He had to find a way to repair the engine and get them home. But the damage was severe, and there was no guarantee that he could make it work. As he examined the broken engine, Cross felt a deep sense of determination. He wasn't going to let these aliens die out here in the cold emptiness of space. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to give up now. "We'll fix this," Cross muttered to himself, as much for his own reassurance as for the aliens. "We'll find a way." Captain Cross stood in front of the broken engine, the dim lights flickering above him as the ship hummed around him. The alien vessel felt more alive than ever, and yet it was also dying. He had a huge task ahead of him, one that would require all his skill, patience, and creativity. The damage to the engine was beyond anything he had dealt with before, but Cross wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. As he took a step back to analyze the situation, the silver-blue alien from earlier moved closer, watching him closely. The crew had become more relaxed around him in the past few hours, understanding that he wasn't their enemy. In fact, they now looked at him with hope, something that had been absent when Cross first boarded the ship. But this hope wasn't without its weight. They were relying on him to get them home, and the pressure hung heavy on his shoulders. "All right," Cross muttered to himself. "Let's see what we can do." The engine was a complicated mess of alien technology, far more advanced than anything on Earth. The materials were unlike anything Cross had ever seen. Despite this, he saw a way forward. His knowledge of Earth's technology, combined with his understanding of basic engineering principles, could help him fix this. The trick was to adapt his skills to this strange, unfamiliar tech. Cross took a deep breath, preparing to dive into the task. He turned to the silver-blue alien and said, "I need some tools, something basic, something I can use to break down the parts. Can you help me with that?" The alien nodded slowly, then moved to a nearby storage locker. Cross watched carefully, the strange creature's movements graceful but filled with hesitation. The alien returned with a few tools that looked familiar but were designed for alien hands. They were clunky, a bit strange, but they would work. Cross didn't hesitate. He began working immediately, ignoring the strange buzzing sounds around him and the constant hum of the ship's failing systems. The crew members watched him from a distance, their eyes wide. Cross could feel their gaze, their quiet trust in him growing with every tool he used and every wire he connected. It was an odd thing. Their eyes said one thing, but their silence spoke even louder. They were used to advanced technology, but there was something about Cross, a human, stepping in and fixing things they couldn't, that inspired respect. The first part of the repair was tedious. Cross had to reroute the engine's damaged circuits, replacing shorted-out wires and adjusting components that didn't fit perfectly. As he worked, he started explaining his actions in simple terms to the aliens, showing them the steps as he went along. The crew members watched intently, their eyes following his every move. It was clear they had never seen someone work this way before. At one point, an alien woman, her skin a deep shade of green, stepped forward. She raised her hand, gesturing at the part of the engine Cross was working on. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to ask a question. Cross took a moment, looking at her curiously. Slowly, he nodded and explained, "I'm replacing this part here. It's broken, but I'm trying to make it work." The alien seemed to understand, giving him a small nod of approval. Cross couldn't be sure, but something about that gesture made him feel like he was making progress, not just with the ship, but with the crew's trust. Hours passed, and slowly, but surely, the ship's systems started to come back to life. The engine still wasn't fully repaired, but the lights were brighter, the humming less erratic. Cross felt a glimmer of hope rise within him. As he finished the last of his adjustments, he turned to the alien crew. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's a start. We'll need more time, but we've got something to work with." For the first time, the crew didn't just stare at him. They smiled. It was subtle, a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Cross had given them something they hadn't had in days: hope. And with that, he knew the journey wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead, but they were on the right path. Captain Cross stood in the dimly lit engine room, his hands covered in grease and sweat. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, taking a deep breath as he looked around. The ship had started to hum more steadily now, a small but significant change. The repairs weren't complete, but the fact that they had come this far felt like a small victory. It was a glimmer of hope in the darkness. As he took a step back to admire his work, he noticed the crew watching him. Their eyes were filled with a mix of awe and gratitude. They had been stranded for what seemed like an eternity, but now they were beginning to see a way out. Cross had given them more than just repairs. He had given them something even more valuable: the belief that they could survive. The silver-blue alien, who had been his main guide since the beginning, stepped forward. The alien's large, dark eyes studied Cross with a quiet intensity. There was no language between them, only the understanding that had slowly developed as Cross worked. The creature placed a hand over its chest, the universal gesture of respect and gratitude. Cross smiled faintly and nodded back, silently acknowledging the alien's thanks. He wasn't in this for praise. He was in this because, deep down, he couldn't stand the idea of leaving them stranded, helpless in the cold vastness of space. The alien gestured toward the back of the room, signaling Cross to follow. They had made progress, but there was still much to be done. Cross knew this wasn't the time to rest. If they were going to survive, he needed to push forward. As Cross followed the alien through the corridors of the ship, he began to notice something else. The crew seemed less tense. The fear and desperation that had filled their faces when he first arrived were now replaced by cautious optimism. It was as if the small progress they had made was enough to breathe life back into their spirits. The group arrived at another control room, this one even more advanced than the last. The walls were lined with unfamiliar panels and glowing symbols. Cross couldn't help but marvel at the alien technology. It was beautiful, intricate, and utterly alien to him. But now it felt like less of a mystery and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The silver-blue alien stepped up to one of the panels and began pressing buttons, their hands moving with precision and familiarity. Cross couldn't understand the alien's actions, but he recognized the familiar rhythm of someone trying to fix a broken system. He stepped up to the panel beside it, scanning the data on the screen. "Let's see what we got here," Cross muttered to himself, running his fingers over the control pad. The systems were still unstable, but the data coming through was promising. He could see energy levels slowly increasing, the engine's temperature regulation starting to normalize. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. He worked for hours, making adjustments, rerouting power, and carefully monitoring the ship's systems. The silver-blue alien stood nearby, occasionally offering assistance, though Cross was careful not to ask too much. The alien's energy seemed drained, as though the long journey had taken a toll. Cross didn't blame them. They had been through far more than he could imagine. After a long stretch of silence, Cross finally stepped back from the console. He took a moment to catch his breath, rubbing his eyes. The ship was now stable, more than it had been in days. There was still work to do, but they had a foundation to build on. The alien crew gathered around him, their faces showing signs of relief. They may not have fully understood everything that Cross had done, but they understood one thing. He had given them a chance to survive, a chance to make it home. Cross nodded to them, offering a smile that was small but genuine. "We're not there yet, but we'll get there," he said softly, knowing that the real challenge was still ahead. For the first time since his arrival, Cross felt like he was truly part of something. These aliens were no longer just strangers lost in space. They were survivors, just like him. And together, they had a chance to make it home. Captain Cross leaned back in the control room chair, staring at the flickering display in front of him. The alien ship had been stabilized, but that was only the first step. He had repaired their power grid, rerouted the engine systems, and patched up several other broken components. Yet, one major challenge remained: getting the ship moving again. The engine was functional, but it wasn't enough. The ship needed to break free from the gravitational pull of a nearby asteroid field. Cross needed to use the ship's remaining power to slingshot the vessel into deep space, a maneuver that required precision, careful planning, and a bit of luck. He ran his hand over his face, the weight of the task settling heavily on his shoulders. The aliens had become more confident since the repairs had begun, but this was a real test. If they failed now, they would be trapped forever. Their hope would fade, and they'd be stuck in the same place, running out of resources. The silver-blue alien stepped up beside him, its large eyes studying the display. It said nothing, but its presence was comforting. Cross had learned to trust the crew. They had come to trust him as well. It was an unspoken understanding that had developed over the last few days, and it gave him a boost of confidence as he prepared to guide them through the next part of the plan. The alien pointed at the control panel and made a low sound, as if to ask a question. Cross glanced at the panel, then at the alien, and smiled. "We're going to use that asteroid's gravity to slingshot us," Cross explained, even though he wasn't sure the alien fully understood. But the crew had watched him fix the engine and systems, and they knew enough to trust him. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." The alien nodded, then stepped back to signal the rest of the crew. They gathered around, standing in silence as Cross prepared the ship for the maneuver. The tension in the air was thick, but there was also a quiet sense of unity. They had all been through so much, and now they were depending on Cross to guide them to safety. Cross adjusted the ship's course, slowly easing the controls to line up with the asteroid field. The ship's engines hummed, the vibrations rattling through his bones as the vessel started to accelerate. He glanced over at the alien crew, their faces reflecting a mix of nervousness and hope. They were about to test their fate, and the outcome was uncertain. He punched in the final adjustments, and the ship began to veer toward the asteroid field. The proximity alarms began to beep, warning of the incoming danger, but Cross ignored them. He had no choice but to trust his instincts and go for it. The asteroid field was their path to freedom. Too slow, and they would be sucked into the field's gravitational pull, lost forever. The ship accelerated, getting closer and closer to the massive asteroids. The crew held their breath, and Cross tightened his grip on the controls. The tension was unbearable. He could feel the weight of their lives in his hands. The moment came. Cross aimed the ship perfectly toward the asteroid's gravity well and pushed the engines to their limits. The ship shot forward with incredible speed, the force of the slingshot pulling the crew's stomachs into their throats. Cross held his breath as the ship soared past the first asteroid, and then another. The force of the slingshot was working, but there was no time to relax. They needed to clear the entire field before the ship could stabilize. The ship vibrated violently as it flew through the asteroid field, narrowly missing massive rocks that passed in a blur. Just as Cross thought they were going to make it, A large asteroid loomed ahead. His heart raced. He veered the ship to the side, and with a loud crash, the ship grazed the asteroid's surface. Sparks flew from the side of the ship as the impact sent them spinning for a moment. Cross gritted his teeth, focusing all his energy on keeping the ship steady. The crew shouted something in their alien language, but Cross couldn't make out the words. He tightened his grip on the controls, pulling the ship back into line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship cleared the asteroid field. Cross let out a deep breath as the ship's systems steadied and the vibrations died down. They had made it. The crew stared at him in stunned silence. The silver-blue alien stepped forward, its face a mix of awe and disbelief. Slowly, it raised its hand and placed it over its chest. The gesture was familiar now, a sign of respect and gratitude. Cross exhaled, his heart still racing. "We did it," he said, his voice shaking slightly with the adrenaline. "We're out of the field." For the first time since he had arrived, Cross allowed himself to smile. The ship wasn't out of danger yet, but they had passed the most dangerous part. The glimmer of hope that had started with the repairs had grown into something more. Captain Cross stood in front of the main view screen of the alien ship, staring out into the deep, black void of space. The ship had successfully cleared the asteroid field, and for the first time since his arrival, the crew seemed to be at ease. The quiet hum of the ship's systems was steady now, the earlier vibrations and flickering lights replaced by a calm, rhythmic pulse. It felt like they had crossed a threshold, and the worst was behind them. But Cross knew they weren't out of the woods just yet. The silver-blue alien who had become his main guide and confidant approached, its dark eyes watching him carefully. The crew had settled into the routine, and Cross could see the change in their demeanor. They were no longer the fearful, anxious beings he had first encountered. They were more relaxed now, even hopeful. They had been given a chance to survive, and they were slowly beginning to trust him as one of their own. "We made it," Cross said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. His fingers rested on the control panel, but he couldn't take his eyes off the stars beyond the ship's hull. The sight was beautiful in its own way, endless and mysterious, but also calm. It felt like they were on the edge of something new, a beginning, not an end. The silver-blue alien stepped forward, placing a hand on Cross's shoulder in a gesture of gratitude. The touch was surprisingly warm and firm, a silent acknowledgement of the human's efforts. Cross gave a tired but appreciative smile, grateful for the alien's trust. "We've still got a long way to go," Cross said, turning to face the alien. "But now we have time. Time to fix the rest of the ship and get you home." The alien nodded slowly, its large eyes scanning Cross with an unreadable expression. It seemed to understand that the journey wasn't over yet. There were still critical repairs to make, more systems to stabilize, and most importantly, a way to reach their home planet. But in that moment, Cross realized that the hardest part was already done. They had made it through the worst of it, and now they just needed to keep going. As he began reprogramming the navigation system, the alien crew gathered around, silently watching as Cross worked. They had no words, but their presence spoke volumes. He had become their lifeline, more than just a rescuer, but a companion on this strange journey through the stars. Hours passed, and Cross continued to make adjustments, fine-tuning the ship's trajectory. The crew was now working alongside him, offering their assistance in whatever way they could. The bond between them was growing stronger, and Cross found himself appreciating their quiet strength. Each alien, though different in appearance, shared the same determination to survive. It was a reminder that no matter the species, the will to live and the desire to overcome obstacles was universal. Finally, after much work, the ship's systems were stable enough for the crew to start planning their next steps. Cross sat down, wiping his hands on his uniform, and looked around at the group. The once silent, fearful beings were now engaged, discussing the course of action in their own language. But Cross could see that they were no longer giving up. They were ready to take the next step forward. He took a deep breath and walked over to the silver-blue alien, who seemed to be waiting for something. "I'm glad I could help," Cross said simply. "We'll get you home." The alien placed a hand on Cross's chest, a simple gesture that carried a depth of meaning. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a promise. Together, they had started something new, a bond forged in the coldest space. The journey was far from over, but Cross knew that as long as they stuck together, they had a fighting chance. With the ship's systems back on track and their course set, the alien crew began to prepare for the long journey ahead. Cross sat back in his seat, feeling a sense of peace. He had come here as a stranger, an outsider, but now he was part of something larger. The unknowns of space no longer seemed so daunting. He wasn't alone. The aliens weren't alone. And together, they would face whatever came next. The stars outside the ship seemed to shine a little brighter as Cross looked forward to the endless possibilities. A new beginning had begun. Captain Cross leaned back in his chair, staring out at the stars. The alien ship had settled into a steady course, the deep hum of its engines now a background melody to the silence around him. The repairs were nearly done, and they had been cruising through space for several days now. The ship was working again, more than he'd hoped for when he first arrived. Still, there was an odd sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. Though the ship was stable, the future remained unclear. There were so many questions still unanswered. Cross turned his attention to the alien crew. They were no longer just strangers from another world. In the days since he fixed their ship, something had changed between them. He had helped them survive, and in return, they had helped him learn more about their kind and their culture. Their silent trust had turned into quiet companionship. They no longer treated him as a savior, but as an equal, someone who belonged among them. The silver-blue alien, the one who had first led him to the control room, walked up beside him. It was still a mystery to Cross how they communicated so silently, but over time, he had come to understand them. Their body language was more expressive than their words, and their eyes, so dark and deep, spoke volumes. The silver-blue alien placed a hand on Cross's shoulder, a familiar gesture that made Cross smile softly. They had come a long way since that first, tense moment when they had all been strangers. "We're almost there," Cross said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. He was speaking to the alien, but also to himself. After all the effort, after all the uncertainty, they were on the final stretch. The crew had managed to keep the ship intact, and Cross had kept it moving forward. They were now headed toward the alien homeworld, wherever that was. And even though the journey wasn't over, he could sense that they were close to the end of their struggle. The alien looked at him, its dark eyes glistening with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something Cross had come to recognize as affection. It was strange. After all, he had never imagined bonding with an alien race, let alone building a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. But somehow he had. The ship hummed gently beneath him as Cross turned his focus back to the navigation controls. The crew was working together now, each alien doing their part, whether it was maintaining the ship's systems or helping with the final preparations for landing. They were a team now. It wasn't just Cross fixing things. It was the crew working alongside him to bring their ship and their journey to a successful conclusion. Cross couldn't help but smile. He had come into this mission expecting nothing but a quiet trip through deep space, but he had found something unexpected. A family of sorts, in the form of beings from another world. They had all been stranded, isolated, and lost. But now together, they had found their way. The silver-blue alien walked to the back of the room and spoke softly to the others, making gestures Cross didn't fully understand. But as he watched them, he realized that they were all finally at peace. They were not alone anymore. They had each other. And as long as they did, the stars didn't seem so empty anymore. The journey had begun with uncertainty, with tension and fear, but now, with the ship on course and the crew working together, there was hope. For the first time since Cross had boarded the alien vessel, he felt something he hadn't expected, a deep sense of belonging. He wasn't just a human helping aliens. He was part of a team. He had helped them, and in return, they had helped him. As the stars stretched out before them, Cross knew that no matter how far the road ahead, they would walk it together. The bond they shared wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper. It was about connection, trust, and the shared journey into the unknown. And for the first time in a long time, Cross felt ready for whatever came next. The stars ahead seemed to shimmer brighter as Captain Cross stood at the helm of the alien ship, the steady hum of its systems filling the quiet. They had made it. The long journey through space, filled with uncertainty and danger, was finally nearing its end. In just a few hours, they would reach the alien homeworld, a place Cross had only heard about in vague descriptions. It was a moment of victory, not just for him, but for the alien crew who had trusted him with their lives. As the ship glided through the vast emptiness of space, Cross couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. When he had first received the distress signal, he hadn't known what to expect. He had been unsure of what he was walking into. Now, looking out at the stars, he realized just how far they had come. From the damaged, dying ship he had boarded to the thriving vessel it was now. The silver-blue alien, the leader of the crew, stood beside him, watching the same stars. The two of them had formed an unspoken bond over the days they had spent together. Though language had been a barrier at first, they had found ways to communicate, through gestures, expressions, and most importantly, actions. The trust between them had grown in ways neither of them could have anticipated. "We're almost there," Cross said, his voice soft but filled with certainty. The alien beside him nodded, understanding that the end of this journey was near. The crew was ready. They had been waiting for this moment for so long, and now they were almost home. The silver-blue alien looked at Cross, its dark eyes filled with gratitude. Then it turned to the rest of the crew, who had gathered in the back of the room. The alien made a gesture with its hand, signaling that it was time to prepare for landing. The crew moved quickly, their movements purposeful and efficient. Cross admired how well they worked together, despite their differences. He had seen this ship and its crew at their lowest, but now they were thriving. As the ship neared the alien planet, Cross felt a mixture of emotions. There was excitement for the crew, who would finally be reunited with their people. But there was also a strange sense of loss. His role in their journey was almost over. Soon, he would be leaving them behind, alone once more. Yet, Cross knew this was how it was meant to be. He had helped them when they needed it the most, and now his part in their story was finished. The ship began its descent toward the planet's surface, its landing gear engaging with a soft thud. Outside, Cross could see the bright, glowing lights of the planet's cityscape growing larger. The alien homeworld was nothing like Earth, but it held its own beauty. Vast landscapes, towering cities, and the soft glow of a planet that had been waiting for its people to return. The crew moved to the landing bay, their faces filled with emotion. Cross watched them, his heart swelling with pride. They had made it, against all odds. They had survived the cold emptiness of space, and now they were home. As the ship touched down, the silver-blue alien turned to Cross. It placed its hand over its chest, the gesture they had used to show respect and thanks. Cross smiled, placing his own hand over his heart in return. There were no words needed now. The bond between them had been formed through actions, through understanding, and through trust. The door of the ship opened, and the crew began to disembark. The planet's bright, welcoming light spilled into the ship, and Cross watched as the aliens stepped out, reunited with their home. He could feel a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he came here to do. And now, it was time to go. Cross turned back to the ship's control panel, preparing to leave. As he looked out one last time at the alien world, he realized that this journey had changed him. He had come here to help, to fix things, But in the end, it wasn't just about the ship. It was about the connections he had made, the bond he had shared with beings from another world. As the ship's engines roared to life, Cross took one final look at the planet below. The stars had always seemed so empty before, but now, they didn't feel so alone. And with that, he left the alien homeworld behind, knowing that the journey, in many ways, had just begun.